In 1991 in West London, the mutilated body of an escort worker was found in a flat. The hunt for the perpetrator, nicknamed the Ripper in the press, saw a convicted sex offender charged, but later acquitted of her murder. The victim's mother warned he would kill again, and 8 years later, he did, in a virtually identical crime. But it would take a change in the double jeopardy law to finally bring him to justice for a murder he committed 3 decades earlier. This is what happens when a dangerous sexual predator is given the opportunity to fulfill his sadistic desires. This is the case of David the Ripper Smith. Hi guys, welcome back to my channel. Thank you for joining me. Today's case is going to be a case which I consider a serial killer case. Lots of different definitions where serial killers are concerned, but for me, this particular individual suits and fits that name perfectly. It's one of those which is deeply frustrating because this man should never have had the opportunity to kill again. In fact, from early on, this man should never have been allowed to walk our streets. Simple as that. For those of you returning here, thanks so much for your support. For those of you supporting me on YouTube membership and Patreon, you're amazing. I could not make this content without you. Thank you so much. Right, let's get on with today's case and let's head back to 1991. So in 1991, we've got a 34-year-old David Smith. He's living with his mum in Hampton, southwest London, and he's working as a lorry driver. His actual colleagues had nicknames for him. And those nicknames were things like Honey Monster and Lurch. I think it's disrespectful to both the Honey Monster and Lurch to actually give him those monikers. Literally. Preferably, I would hang out with either of those two mythical creatures than this absolute reprehensible human being. Now, the reason that he got those names was because he was 6'3", but also he was a really large 18-stone build. And whenever I'm talking about a predator and we contextualize his size and weight, it just makes it even more terrifying to imagine the poor victims, because physicality-wise, somebody is going to be able to dominate you at that level. It brings to mind people like Ed Kemper, who was 6'9". Again, these individuals might not seem threatening when you're just chatting to them on a daily, but if they're coming for you, you can't even begin to envisage the horror and the knowledge that you were just no match for that kind of physicality. Also, the reason that they called him those names was because of his manner of speech, because he was considered polite, softly spoken, and a conscientious employee. But then, organised serial killers, that's how they sound too, isn't it? It's exactly how they sound. Massive chameleons. He had an unbelievably darker side to his nature, because what people didn't know when he was softly speaking to them or being a conscientious worker was that actually he was a major sexual sadist. And as I've said, if you combine that with his sheer size, and also he's a martial arts expert, that just makes him an incalculable serious threat to women. Now, during his teenage years, he had some really obsessive fantasies, and those obsessive fantasies ended up graduating into serious criminal behaviour. Again, what do we see historically with serial killers? Graduation of petty offences into more serious, eventuating in the ones that we're talking about in situations like today. And he got involved in a string of sex offences against women. Now, in 1976, he is literally aged 18. That's right, 18. You know, where most of us are just imagining that we can go to the pub and legally have a pint. Well, not for this individual. No, his fantasies aren't about just being a normal, naive young person. He's thinking about sexual sadism, and he rapes a woman at knife point in her home in front of her young children. Yeah, he basically spots her fixing curtains in a living room, knocks on the door and then threatens her with a 7-inch knife. Now, he ends up getting jailed for 4 years. I do not know who decided that was an appropriate sentence. Can we just run through that again? He spots the woman who's just innocently sorting her curtains out. He knocks on the door, threatens her with her life, and then basically proceeds to traumatize her children and her by raping her in front of them. And yet he gets 4 years. Seriously? The judges back in the day, I have serious questions about. I wonder what some of them were doing in their background and pastimes, because that is not taking the post-trauma of a female victim seriously in any universe. So 4 years is what he gets. I imagine consequentially he thinks it was almost worth it because it's so piffly. And then around a decade later, so this is in 1987, at this point he's working as an unlicensed cab driver. He literally locks a 30-year-old female customer in his car. Now, he does actually release her, but the only reason for that is because she goes absolutely schizoid when it came down to refusing to comply in that situation. She screams, she's attempting to kick the window through, and basically he doesn't know how to manage her because she isn't acting like the victim that he would expect her to be, i.e. scared and compliant. Now, he subsequently gets convicted of false imprisonment, but for that, bearing in mind what we know about him already, he receives a 2-year suspended sentence. Yeah, 2 years. She managed to escape with her life, essentially, and we all know what would have happened if she hadn't put up that kind of fight. The likelihood is it would have been a serious sexual assault or even worse. Now, Smith has at some point managed to have a relationship with a woman that was consenting because he's briefly married in 1982. But according to Smith, it was like a really negative experience for him. Was it, Smith? Was it really negative for you? It must have been so negative for you because obviously with such a lovely pro-social conscience, people like you, you're victims, aren't you, all the time? And this woman that you married was clearly someone who was so dominating and controlling. Genuinely, that's what he said, that she was really controlling. And within months, apparently she had an affair with their lodger. Then apparently she'd got into trouble by stealing money, and that had apparently destroyed his relationship with his father. And he claimed that basically the reason for all of his crimes subsequently was the violence that he felt because of the internalized rage towards this woman who'd betrayed him. So it's not his fault at all. Basically, for this killer, he's saying that it's all down to some woman cheating on him and nicking a bit of cash. Could you imagine if the world worked that way and that was a license to just go out and do the most heinous things? Well, he cheated on me, she cheated on me, so I went out and just basically became a sexual predator. Makes perfect sense. Obviously no one's going to question that, is it? We see this again in serial killers, minimization. The minimization of their crimes and the projection onto other people. And clearly he is very well trained in this because at the point that he's blaming her, he has this mindset already. It's as simple as that. We see in his past that he's a sexual predator. So this is just BS. And like I said, this is the minimization element. Now, after his marriage fails and his ex has a majorly lucky escape, as far as I'm concerned, he goes home to mummy. And don't get me wrong, that's not being disrespectful towards his mother. It's what good mums do. Your kid's struggling, they need somewhere to live, they need some shelter, you will provide that. But also it gives him a bit of freedom because at the end of the day, when you go home to mum, the truth is you're gonna have your meals cooked, you're gonna have your clothes washed, the likelihood is you're gonna have more time and you're certainly gonna have a bit more income because you're not paying your bills. So he starts to use the extra money to use sex workers and he's using them very, very frequently. And he starts to develop what I would suggest is a really unhealthy obsession with various women. Now, one of these women, Janet, he actually meets at the Eureka Club in October 1989. Now, this is a naturist club in Kent. Now, obviously, naturists are not swingers. There is a clear definition and differentiation between a naturist who just likes getting naked and walking around. Honestly, I'm going to be real with you guys. If there was a personal hell, that would be mine. I once had an experience in Germany when I was 14 where the people that I was staying with, which was with a family on a week's exchange essentially, they knew that my nasal passages were problematic. I'm really nasally, you'll know that from the way I speak. And so they decided that I needed to go into a mental sauna. What they didn't tell me was that that would be like in this area where men and women were just all completely stark bollock naked. I've literally never got past that. I did wear my red Speedo costume the entire time. It was harrowing. I appreciate there's nothing wrong with showing your naked body. It's just not for me. It's not for me. It's not for me. But that's naturism, whereas swinging is obviously sex-based. But it feels like there was like an interlapping of these in this situation for him, because with Janet, he'd become friends with her and her husband, and even though they were like hanging out in this naturist zone, he does end up going back to her camper van for sex with her. And he subsequently kept on having sex with her on multiple occasions. This was even at her home. And one of the things that Janet had experienced was she'd had breast implants, but also she'd had a hysterectomy. And obviously when you have breast implants, particularly back in the day, because they've moved on a great deal and there is short scars now, etc. But back then, you know, there was quite invasive procedures, and breast implants would cause quite a lot of scarring, and also a hysterectomy. Again, these days, it's done in a very non-invasive way to some degree, as in they use microsurgery. But back then, it was incredibly invasive. I mean, my mum had a cut all the way across the bottom of her stomach. And so the scars would be relatively extensive for Janet. So she is obviously showing him these scars, and it just titillates him. He's super excited by it. He becomes really excited sexually by her scars. And in some of his crimes later down the line, he would literally recreate those scars and markings on his own victims. And I guess that was because he couldn't ever have Janet. Janet rejected him in the long term. And she became, I suppose, a feature of abandonment and rejection, but also lustful desire. And so those connecting meant that the feelings that he had for Janet that he couldn't now have with her, he used in a malevolent way on his victims, and potentially as well. He uses his feelings of abandonment by her to further amplify and give permission to the actions that he carries out. Now, at one point, despite being a convicted rapist, he ran his own escort agency. What could be safer? What could be safer for these women than being sex workers employed by a sexual sadist predator? It seems like the perfect marriage. But back in the day, clearly, these kind of things happened because the DBS checks that we have these days, the references that people need, etc., they just didn't exist back then. I swear to God, anybody could do anything in the 80s and early 90s. You know, he was hiring out the girls for 250 quid a night, so that's a high level of money for the time. We're not talking about presently, we're talking about back then. 250 quid now would still be considered a very good rate. And he obviously has taken a cut of every single one of their takings, but it says something about him wanting to be surrounded by sex. He wants to be surrounded by women, and he wants to be dominating and controlling, because obviously he's actually taking money from them for their actual encounters. So again, the mindset and the subset within him internally is all about sex and domination. Now, I would say it's around this time that Smith is basically escalating in this spiral of violence and depravity. And in August 1991, he's literally charged with the attempted rape of another woman. So he takes his escort worker to the Retreat Hotel in Ashford. According to her, she goes to the bathroom, but when she gets out, the door's locked. He's got no trousers on, and he's wearing plastic surgical gloves. That is going to terrify the life out of any human being. It doesn't matter whether you're a sex worker who's been involved with kinks, it doesn't matter if you're involved in the S&M community. When somebody acts in a way that is not accordant to what you've agreed and additionalizes it by wearing plastic surgical gloves, and it doesn't take people more than a millisecond to think, why would anybody be wearing surgical gloves? I mean, even if you have a kink for them, you're going to have to explain it first, because anybody walking in is going to think, gonna murder me, they're going to murder me. They're wearing surgical gloves specifically to end my life. Now, he also threatens her with a Stanley knife, so now he's armed. But thank God, and maybe it's down to the fact that she's a sex worker. She will have been through things that are horrible, because the truth is sex workers go through violent assaults during their career. Often they go through sexual sadism, often they're raped. So to some degree, there will be a level of preparedness within that. And she is able to escape. And she actually flags down a passing police car, thank God, universe. And at this point, Smith is arrested. Now, it goes to trial. So a lot of times back in the day, if a sex worker was basically accusing somebody of doing something inappropriate to them, they're not necessarily met or treated with the respect they deserve. But obviously it was taken really, really seriously, because it goes to trial, but the victim doesn't turn up to give evidence. Now, I cannot tell you how common this is. It is something that is well noted in research where the justice system is concerned. When you are a sex worker and you are fully aware that when you turn up to court, they are going to absolutely, as the defense, try to deride you, to ridicule you, to make you come across like you are an unworthy human being deserving of what you've dealt with, then it can be really, really terrifying. And on top of that, we also have to add in lifestyle choices sometimes can be problematic. So I've worked with sex workers who have dependency issues. And when you're a dependent and potentially you're coming down off drugs, the idea of going to court and facing a judge and jury is completely disturbing. And that's why often people just don't turn up. But of course, because she does not turn up and she fails to give evidence, he's just acquitted and he's at liberty again. So now he's even understood that when he's caught and taken to trial, somehow he still manages to get away with it. And that means no consequential reinforcement whatsoever. He probably just feels above the law at this point. So now he's free, and his insatiable desires, combined with quite a number, shall we say, of rejections from women for good reason, because I wouldn't want to hang around this freak. They're all about to have what I would say become deadly consequences. So this culmination, this pumping of these feelings that he has of rage and entitlement, and the fact that they're not being satiated because the women aren't doing what he believes he deserves them to do because of this domination within his personality. He wants to build the ante, essentially. He's getting higher and higher in his need to amplify these deadly desires. Now, one of his victims, 33-year-old Sarah Crump, she was somebody who was absolutely adored. So she was really well loved in her family, very supportive family. She was a much loved sister, an absolutely adored daughter. She was a loved aunt. Her family described her as bubbly. She was really popular. They said that one of the problems, really, when you put it in the feature of what we're talking about today, is that she was really trusting. And we all go through micro-trusts every single day. You know, we trust that we're not going to choke on our toast in the morning. We trust that our partner's on the whole not going to kill us. We trust that when we get on the bus, we won't get knocked down and killed on it before we actually embark. These are all things that we have to do to give ourselves this myth of security. And it's the same when we meet new people. It's very rare that we meet somebody and think, oh, I can't be around you. Even if we've got misgivings about them, we'll tend to override them because we're brought up in a society that tells us that we've got to be a good person and a nice person. And that can mean that we allay our fears, which is deeply problematic in the long term when we're considering things like meeting somebody like this man. So she had this amazing smile as well, you know, an attractive woman. And she just embodied, as far as her family and friends were concerned, an absolutely adored individual with a really hopeful future. She was in a relationship. She had a really long-term boyfriend, Mohammed Yunus. He was a minicab driver. And she'd even worked as a psychiatric nurse, so she was a clever woman. But at the time of her murder, she was actually working as secretary in the chiropody department at Wimbledon Hospital. And they said that she was an absolutely excellent employee, and she'd actually been offered a permanent position, which again embodies the fact that she was clearly somebody who was really good at what she was doing. But there was a secret, because what her family and her boyfriend didn't actually know was that to some degree she was living a double life at that time. So some evenings she started doing escort work, and she was an escort under the name Angie. Now, the reason and motivation it seems to be for her taking up this extra work without telling her family and without telling a partner was she was absolutely desperate to have a baby. But she and Mohammed had just been unable to conceive, so she was undergoing IVF. And that's something that I relate to because IVF has been a big feature in my own life, and it is crippling cost-wise. It genuinely is. And keeping up with the costs and the additional costs and the further tests and the disappointments and all the things that you have to go through, it's really hard for people to understand, because when people talk about IVF and you look at the price list, they hide the vast majority of costs. So you're not paying what's on paper. That's just for one portion of it, and it looks attractive, but in reality, it's absolutely debilitating. And these weren't rich people. So she was not somebody who had loads of additional income that she could just use for IVF. And the desire to be a mother is so powerful that potentially the only reason that she started doing the escort work was to fund the IVF treatment, which is just horrific. That a loving woman with the potential to be an incredible mother basically has to sell her body to achieve that hope, to achieve that goal. And also, I think psychologically, she must have been really struggling with the deception, because she wouldn't have wanted a family to know. She wouldn't have wanted a partner to know. It was no bearing on them or disrespect to them. In fact, it was quite the contrary. She's just trying to create a family. Now, it's through this ill-fated, I suppose, escort work that her paths end up crossing with Smith. Now, he disguises his name, he calls himself Duncan, and he gets in contact and basically arranges to go to her flat for sex during his week off work. And he offers her £150 to actually sleep with him and to have sex with him. And arguably, when you're trying to save up money, that is going to seem like a very attractive offer. So we get to the evening of the 28th of August 1991. This is just 10 days after Smith had actually attempted to rape the other escort that I just mentioned. Now, he is deeply calculating. So first of all, he arranged to go to Sarah's one-bedroomed flat. He arrives there. This is at 4 Joyner Court, Lady Margaret Road in Southall, West London. Now, during their earlier conversations when he's been arranging this particular relational experience with her, shall we say, he actually says to her that he'd once been attacked by another man at an escort's house. Now, Sarah at this point is just really reassuring. She says, well, that's not going to happen to you. There's not going to be anyone else present. You don't have to worry about that. But he isn't asking for that reason. There's absolutely no concern that he has. Remember the size of this man? He's a martial artist expert. He has no concerns or considerations or fear about some guy being present, some security being there. And that does happen in sex work. There are agencies where there'll be a driver outside, for example, waiting for that individual to finish their session, and then they pick them up and they know that they're going to be safe. And there are all these kind of call-ins, etc. So it is possible that security is available to sex workers, but there wasn't as far as it was going for her. But he's done this for one reason and one reason only. He just wants to establish that she's going to be alone. And he even went further than just asking that question, because he's obviously quite suspicious, and he also doesn't want to get disturbed. That's really important. Bear in mind, this man wants time with her. So he goes on, and actually when he turns up, he says that he's going to pay, obviously, when he arrives, and he tells Sarah that he's going to pay by cheque. But when he turns up, he doesn't have his cheque guarantee card with him. Now, he knows at this point she's not going to accept a cheque without it, because she's not guaranteed that it won't bounce, and basically she wants to have that security. So he then says, okay, I'll just go to a cash point, and that's what he does. And they actually have records of transactions from that cash point, which confirms he withdraws £150. But it's all a ruse, because if somebody else had been in the property with her, it basically gave him opportunity to leave and not return. Whereas if indeed she was alone, he'd get the cash and then he'd return, which he did. So there's a hell of a lot of calculation there. And of course, we have this young, petite woman thinking everything's going to be okay. He's going ahead and getting the cash out for her. She's feeling no threat at this moment in time because he's doing what he's saying and he seems to be trustworthy, and she'll have had no idea what's about to transpire. And to be fair, it's not exactly known, because we would understand that Sarah just expected this to be another escort job, a consensual sexual encounter in return for cash. But Smith had absolutely alternative ideas. He'd gone to her flat armed with a knife, and his whole presence was being there to play out his darkest fantasies. What we do know is that at 2 a.m, Sarah did call her escort agency, and that's basically their standard safety protocol. And that protocol, of course, is something that Smith was very aware of. He ran his own agency. So at this point, she speaks to the agency boss, Lisa Pegg, and at this point confirms that the client had left. Now, Lisa at that moment in time felt that she sounded really strange on the call, that Sarah wasn't herself. She didn't give her escort name. She didn't give her real name. And also, the call was really brief and really abrupt. And it's a shame that Lisa didn't think maybe thinking that that's strange could indicate that Sarah's in some danger. But she didn't. Yeah, it was a weird call, but she didn't believe that there was any threat. Now, true to his usual MO, it's believed that what Smith was doing at that time was threatening Sarah. And he basically forced her to make the call, probably holding the knife to her throat, just as he'd done with all the other victims. And then Sarah had been taken through into her bedroom. That's when she was forced to lie naked on a bed before being killed in the most brutal of ways. And it's the only way it can be described. Absolute brutality and butchering. Now, after he kills Sarah, Smith then took time. He really did. So first of all, he's going around carefully removing any evidence that could identify him. He removed fingerprints from literally anything he'd touched. He washed the blood from himself in the bathroom sink. And this just demonstrates the cool, calculated regime that he involved himself, making sure that as far as he was concerned, apprehension would be impossible. And he did this for potentially hours, because these were happening in the early hours of the morning, so no one had actually got any reason to suspect that Sarah was in any danger. Now, obviously, Sarah fails to turn up for work the next day, and then her boyfriend's desperately trying to get in contact with her. It's really unlike her. She's not connecting with him, and he does this for the next few days, and then he finally managed to get keys to her flat. This is on the 1st of September 1999. He must have been frantic. Now, he briefly goes inside, calls her name, but there's no response. So he just assumes that she wasn't home. He didn't check in the bedroom. He didn't check in the bathroom. He just assumes that because of silence, she's not present. Now, he reports her missing that same day. When the officers enter her flat, they obviously immediately suspect that something bad has happened because they find blood in the bathroom. They also find blood on a dressing table. Nothing prepares them for what they actually see on her bed, because it is just soaked in blood, drenched, and then they discover her butchered body. They don't know whether she was sexually assaulted before or after her death, but based on what we know about Smith and based on what Smith later tells a fellow inmate, probably both. And it's also impossible to establish whether she was actually tortured before being killed, or whether what can only be described as extensive mutilation had occurred post-mortem. Because she'd had a fatal wound. They could pick up from the autopsy that had been to her neck. It severed her carotid artery, and also to her chest. She'd actually been stabbed in the heart and the left lung. So he was definitely going to kill her. There's no doubt. They weren't inflicted wounds they thought she could survive. They were highly unsurvivable. But then Smith had actually proceeded to cut off both her breasts, and that didn't seem to satisfy him. Then he opened up a torso and even removed a piece of a small bowel, and they were placed on the bed next to her. In fact, when the press covered this case, they compared it to the Jack the Ripper killings, because it was just so grotesque and the mutilation was of such a high level. Now, it doesn't take long before Smith is actually identified as a person who'd been known to see Sarah and be the last person to see Sarah at her flat. Now, at this point, they arrest and charge him with murder. He, of course, pleads not guilty because he's a majorly psychopathic individual who genuinely thinks that he can control the world. And he ends up getting held on remand for 18 months, which is good because it means that no other woman can come to harm at his hands. Now, whilst he's awaiting this trial, he claims that he'd basically gone to Sarah's for a massage and nothing more. And then he'd left her unharmed. Of course he had, even though he's a massive sexual predator. And we can see that in all of his background evidence. But the rate for a massage was 25 quid. Not the £150 he'd withdrawn from the cash machine. That was the going rate for sex. So as far as we are all concerned, bang to rights at the end of the day. Last person seen with this particular individual got out 150 quid because that's sexual intercourse and that's what you pay for it. Lies and says, I only wanted a massage and she was fine. That deception in itself is enough to cause question to the not guilty. So we get to the Old Bailey in July 1993. The defence basically say, our client is innocent. And actually, the police have been really incompetent and they've withheld evidence. And they also argue that the fingerprints that were found on the bedroom door handle and on the drawer under Sarah's bed had been left by the real unidentified killer. So they're now trying to throw in that because there are other men's fingerprints or people's fingerprints that they haven't been able to identify, that would be the killer. As opposed to the guy with the massive sexual predator rap sheet that's already done these horrible offences before and whose fingerprints would certainly be there because he's admitted to being present and being the last person to see her. But this is what they say. And bear in mind, all you have to do with a jury is give them enough reasonable doubt. And it works. He gets acquitted by the jury. How blindsiding is that for the family? Can you imagine going through that whole trial process thinking that at least you're going to get a legacy of justice for the person that you love and that you've lost, and then this monster just gets to walk away? I mean, her mother, Pat Rhodes, she said it was without a doubt Smith had escaped justice, and also she said he'll kill again. And she was absolutely 100% right. He would kill again. Now, meanwhile, the police, they actually closed the file. They weren't ever even looking for somebody else in connection with that murder. As far as they were concerned, they had the guy, and that guy had been freed by a court, by a judge, and by a jury. And their hands were tied. There was nothing that they could do. But ultimately, they knew that he was guilty as hell. I can't even imagine how devastating that would be for the police. They must have been so angry, the officers who were involved there. One, because their professional conduct had actually been called into question. But secondly, I think they'd have thought it was an open and shut case. And as we see, these things don't always play out as we imagine. So we get to the 24th of April. This is 1999. Now that night, he'd actually gone and visited a brothel in Ilford, Essex. It was apparently described as a night for broad-minded adults. I shall allow you all to imagine what kind of a brothel environment would be for broad-minded adults. I mean, just a brothel for me would be quite broad-minded. Anything further than that seems a little bit extreme. Just going to throw it out there. But when they looked into this, what was really going on was there was an S&M orgy taking place. And it featured things like a love dungeon, and this had loads of instruments of sexual torture within it. And whilst he's actually in this club, he notices a cross. And this cross was something that patrons could be tied to and then be willingly subjected essentially to S&M torture, which is obviously consenting, and that's fine if that's one of your kinks. But Smith had actually asked if one of the sex workers could be tied to it. So one of the women who works there, he wants to tie them up to this basic cross. Crucifixion, we could throw it in there, couldn't we? Like a reliving a crucifixion kind of thing. Because what he wants to do is do that and then inflict pain on her. Now you can understand that the people running the show were like, you're an oddball. Absolutely not. It's for custom. If you want to get up there and get hurt, that's cool. We're all invested there. That's why the night's been put on. But no, you're not taking one of our girls and doing this to her. That's not how this works. Now, it turns out he obviously hadn't felt satisfied by that. He leaves the club around 11:30 p.m. and in his own words, he was feeling Randy, which is just bonkers considering he's just been in a sex club for the broad-minded with lots of people where you could have satisfied your desires. But clearly, he doesn't want to satisfy his legal consensual desires. He wants to satisfy his sadistic, illegal desires. So the first thing he thinks about is going and finding a sex worker. And he goes to Paddington, and unfortunately, he meets a young woman who's 21-year-old Amanda Walker. This young mother has a 2-year-old son. She's new to sex work. She's so young. She comes from a really respectable family in Swarcliffe, Leeds, and she'd actually had an encounter with the law earlier that night. She'd been arrested in Paddington for solicitation, but then she'd been released around midnight, which is such a shame. I know that we probably all agree that arresting sex workers is not something that should occur because these are not individuals who are committing crimes. They are providing a service, and no matter how you feel about those things, they're not doing things that are going to cause anybody else harm, so to speak. But at the end of the day, on this occasion, I really wish that she'd been kept in. But because she gets let out at midnight, she actually makes her way back to Paddington, and here she is very sadly approached by Smith. So Smith then drives into this secluded wooded area in Wisley, Surrey. It's actually near to the Royal Horticultural Society's estate, and it's a place where sex workers and clients frequently go for sex. Also, it was a place that was very well known for dogging as well. For those of you who might not be schooled in the area of what dogging is, it basically means that people will go and have sex in cars or sex outside of cars sometimes, and lots of people will watch either from a distance, or they'll come up and watch, or they'll actually get involved with the sexual encounters. It's one of those kinks I don't understand, but it does happen. So it's somewhere that he goes quite a lot. It's somewhere that is well known to him, and he'd been there before spying on couples having sex. Now, Amanda is never seen again. It's as simple as that. She just essentially disappears that evening. And like I said, the gruesomeness of the familiarity with that area as well, the fact that he's been there many times and watched other people having sex, and has, of course, this predilection and almost a profound need for sadism. I am like thinking about how many other things that this guy has probably done and got away with, genuinely, because this is a man who lives for this kind of environment. Now, her body is found on the 27th of May, 1999. So that's almost 5 weeks after her disappearance. And the reason that her body's found is not necessarily because people are looking for her. It's because people start complaining about this pungent smell. And it turns out that when they find where that smell is coming from, it's from a shallow grave, and it'd just been covered with leaves, essentially. Now, because of the time that had passed between her being murdered and her body being found, it was actually quite difficult to establish how she'd been killed, because there was an advanced state of decomposition. But it was obvious that she'd definitely been murdered. And one of the things that was really striking and equally grotesque is that her genitalia had been really badly mutilated. So again, the reports in the press start to bring up those comparisons to Jack the Ripper, because again, you're thinking this has got to be an individual who is literally going around and mutilating women. So Smith is soon arrested. And the reason for that is because they obviously know that he's on their radar. This is a sex offender. One of the things that they found was that the killer had dumped Amanda's blood-stained clothing on a footpath. So police had searched known sex offenders close to the clothes that had been found, and Smith was identified as a potential suspect. I mean, his home was literally just a mile away. Also, his DNA. Yes, that's right. DNA. So we've now got an absolute link that provides an exact match to the blood found on the disregarded clothing of the murder victim. Also, witnesses had seen a guy matching his description, and can we all be real? He was one of those people that you would notice in a crowd, most of the time because his head would be a whole head higher than everybody else in the crowd, but also because he does look a little bit strange. And people had even seen him picking up Amanda on the night that she was last seen alive, so automatically he's going to be in the frame. And let's be honest, the police are certainly going to have, I don't know, a sense of elation picking him up, because I imagine they're thinking, you're not going to go away this time, mate. This time, we've got you. bang to rights. This time, there's going to be no acquittal. This time, there's not going to be an opportunity for you to pull the wool over the eyes of a jury. So Smith has to enter, of course, his plea. And he pleads not guilty. Of course he does. Not guilty. And the reason that he's going to go not guilty, he's got a prototype now, hasn't he? I don't need to say I'm guilty. All I need to claim is that, of course, I had sex with this woman. I had consensual foreplay with her. But at the end of the day, I had left her unharmed. Just going to throw it out there, David. It seems that the women that you have sex with keep coming up dead. So we're not believing that you're potentially somebody who just drops them off unarmed. Is there somebody stalking you going, well, I'll just go over the clients that David goes for and then I'll murder them afterwards so that David looks like he's in the frame? Actually, that might be a defence I'll use. That's the kind of stuff that goes through these kind of killers' minds, isn't it? Honestly. So Smith goes ahead, says he's not guilty for a murder. It's all consensual, left her unharmed. Literally, word for word, almost the same story given following Sarah's killings 8 years earlier. He claimed that the blood that he'd actually got on Amanda's clothes, because obviously his blood is there, is because before he'd met her, he'd fallen and hit his face on the pavement after leaving a sex party. And not just that, at the end of the day, Amanda had then tended to his cut lip and he'd bled on her. Honestly, why do we even try these individuals? With those kind of ludicrous excuses, just open a cell door, throw them in, lock it, and just, I don't know, give them food once or twice a week till they die. Hopefully, after a long period of deep boredom, stress, and regret. Just throwing it out there. The world according to my laws. But this is what he's saying, that it had been this lovely, tender interaction. That's what we'd say, isn't it? This lovely girl tending to his cut lip after he smashed his face on a pavement. I don't know about you. If there is one thing that makes me want to go and procure a sex worker, it's after falling out of a sex party, smashing my face on a pavement, bleeding out, and the first thing I'm thinking is, I'd really like to have sex now. I mean, God damn it, what goes on in the minds of these individuals? Now, Smith does get convicted of Amanda's murder. This is in December 1999. Hallelujah, praise the Lord. And initially, he's sentenced to life with no minimum term. But then actually it gets set at a later date to 18 years, which when you think about the things I've told you about this guy, he should not be walking our streets ever as a free man. This is one absolutely beyond dangerous sexual predator and murderer. Now, during his time, he went to HMP Wakefield. We all know what that's known as. It's considered a very, very dangerous prison. It houses some of the worst murderers. He apparently regularly played cards with serial killer GP Harold Shipman. Takes one to know one, doesn't it? Really does. Like, serial killers, anyone? Serial killers? Oh, Dr. Harold Shipman. 218 people that you murdered. Do you want a game of chess? It's going to be great. Honestly, it worries me that these kind of individuals almost get to amplify one another's behaviour to some degree because they spend time with each other. Because I don't just think they were looking at being grandmasters. I think they were probably talking about what they did as well, with a notable realisation that they could share information without it going any further. Now, whilst incarcerated, Smith does actually admit killing Amanda to a prison psychologist. So, according to Smith, so we can take this with a bit of a pinch of salt, but according to Smith, something inside him had snapped. This is just a tale of old, where these kind of killers are concerned. It's a tale of old. It was a dark force. It was a monster within me. Honestly, look at people like Chris Watts. You know, it wasn't him. It was this being within him. It's a way of minimising and reducing blame and also making themselves seem like a victim to darker forces. But the truth is, of course, this is just somebody with a premeditated desire to harm women. Now, apparently, when he grabbed hold of Amanda and he wouldn't let her go, she starts to struggle. Really? Sorry, I'm just gonna throw it out there for a minute. Can we just throw it out there for a minute? Can we just go over that statement again? This is why I could never be a prison psychologist. This is why, because this is how the sessions would go. This is exactly how the sessions would go. Can I just question you? You say that when you grabbed hold of Amanda and you wouldn't let go, she struggled. Yeah, she struggled. Can I ask you what you would imagine would be anything other than a normal reaction, aside from struggling when somebody won't let you go? If somebody won't let you go, you're going to have to struggle to be let go of. Is that not resonating? Anyway, that's what he says. So now she's kind of a problem. And obviously there's a bit of projection of blame there, isn't it? Because she's struggling. And apparently during the struggle, she'd screamed and bitten his finger, which had caused him to bleed on her. Honestly, there are other areas of his body that I wish she'd had in his mouth that she could have bitten down real hard on during this moment. Because I think that would have given her a fighting chance. Unfortunately, a finger isn't going to do it. But again, he's minimising now she's issue because she's essentially harmed him. So now he's really angry. He's legitimising that anger. He's got a permission base for it. So then apparently he makes her undress and, quote, accidentally suffocated her by placing his hand over her mouth during sex before burying her in a shallow grave. I, as the prison psychologist, would have locked the door, obviously have had some kind of security available to me, or maybe just like a steel unit between me and him, and refused to have let him go until he filled in the actual gaps, because that is just such an unacceptable story of the reality of what we're talking about. Because the description of Amanda's killing was a tiny fragment of what Smith actually did. You know, he missed out some pretty essential components. So first of all, how he fulfilled his warped sadistic desires by mutilating her genitals, you know? And there was clearly a reason why Smith didn't mention that mutilation, because he didn't want to be connected to Sarah's murder 8 years earlier, because that had involved mutilation. And of course, we know he'd been acquitted for that. Wrongly acquitted, entirely incorrectly acquitted, but nonetheless acquitted. So whilst he ultimately admits to Amanda's murder, he continues to adamantly deny mutilating her body. Now, bear in mind, the reason that he's admitting to Amanda's murder, of course, is because there is a level set where he could apply for parole down the line. And unless you take responsibility for it, the parole board are not going to look kindly on you because you're not taking accountability and responsibility for your actual crimes. So there is method to his admission, but he's just minimising enormously. Now, like so many killers, particularly serial killers when they get arrested, I keep harking back to serial killers, don't I, in this case? One of the things that we see they struggle with in the long term is to resist talking about their crimes. Because they want to talk about their crimes, because they're proud of them. And also, they're titillated by them. It's psychological anchoring. It's a way of reminding yourself and reliving and revisiting the experience. And so, of course, you can keep it in for a while, but you build some relationships, you build some bonds with individuals who are in prison with you, you spend a lot of time with them, then at times you're going to take a risk and you're going to start opening up about what brought you to that position. So whilst he is being held on remand at HMB Highdown for Amanda's murder, he had actually given a confession to a fellow inmate called Stephen Williams. Now that confession that he made back then, that would actually have profound repercussions in Sarah's unsolved murder case. Because Williams and Smith, they see each other on a daily basis in prison, and Smith gets talking, a bit of trust is built, which is ironic because they're all in prison, and at the end of the day, if you're going to throw trust around, you probably want to think about people being trustworthy, and just going to say that maybe prison isn't the most ideal place to have trusting bonds and relationships, but what do I know? What do I know? So Williams and Smith have this relationship. Smith tells him about the S&M clubs he used to visit in London. He talks about how he likes to see girls tied up. He likes to see them in pain. And as time progresses, just more and more, he starts to open up to Williams until finally he described in detail not just Amanda's killing, but also Sarah's. In fact, he even goes so far as to demonstrate how he'd mutilated her body by cutting off her breasts. He claimed that the killing had been sexy. And furthermore, He even boasted as to how he'd managed to get away with it because the police didn't have any evidence against him. He also went on to describe Amanda's murder, said that he'd bound her wrists, he'd wrapped her in polythene, then he'd cut her downstairs before and after having sex with her. Apparently he told Williams that he liked to see girls' flesh cut and he liked to see the blood coming out when he was having sex. Now, despite the fact that, of course, we have Smith happily connecting and confiding in Williams, because essentially he knew that Williams was actually a sex offender, he obviously believed that all sex offenders were as warped as he was. And of course, that's not the case. Like, don't get me wrong, Williams was a sex offender and his crimes are appalling. But at the end of the day, Williams isn't a monster in the degree that we're talking about where Smith is concerned. This is somebody who's actually appalled by what is heard. He can't believe it. And he goes ahead and he notifies the authorities. It's blowing his mind that he's got all of this information about these crimes and he's watching a man take utter pleasure in explaining what he did. And it just gets too much for him. Now, despite more than a decade having passed since Sarah's murder, the Met Police had kept her case under review. They were absolutely convinced that they'd always got the right man. But according to the double jeopardy rule, Smith couldn't actually be tried again from an offence which had already been acquitted. That used to exist. So pre the Criminal Justice Act 2003, if you had been tried and acquitted, even if you admitted it and things came to light that clearly demonstrated it was you, you had been tried and found not guilty and it stood. It's horrific, but it was real. But it changes with the Criminal Justice Act 2003, and this allows retrials for very serious offences, and rightly so. If you haven't seen my Gary Allen serial killer murder doc that I've done on this channel, please go and watch it, because again, that's all about new and compelling evidence coming to light and a serial killer being finally brought to justice after escaping justice for a long period of time. And it's the same here. So this new and compelling evidence does come to light, and it comes to light in multiple forms. So there's Smith's prison confession to Williams, but we appreciate that a prison confession is probably not going to be enough because people will always question the individual who is actually telling them the confession, because clearly it could be that they're trying to bolster their own reputation so that maybe they're going to get a release when the parole board hear about how good they've been, or it could be that a jury won't take it as seriously because an individual who's already in prison has heard the confession, and so on and so forth. But you have to add to that, it was the striking similarities between Sarah's and Amanda's murders. So both were sex workers, both were mutilated after death. Also, there was this pattern of Smith's increasing violent behaviour towards women, but also there was new fingerprint evidence. Yes. So the unidentified fingerprints found at Sarah's crime scene, which the defence had basically claimed were from a real killer, that turned out to belong to the previous owner of the flat. So now they were able to discount those fingerprints that were the only other, I suppose, piece of evidence that somebody else could have been there, and dispel that evidence because it was the owner of the flat who'd lived there prior to that, who had left them, not the killer at all. So now, if you add all of that together, they feel they have a case. They feel there is a potential that they can connect Smith and put him back on trial for Sarah's murder. And in 2022, the Court of Appeal approved an application to do just that. They squashed his earlier acquittal and they ordered a retrial. I imagine that the police were doing a dance when that happened. I genuinely do. Now, at the time, bear in mind, Smith had already served his minimum term for Amanda's murder. He hadn't yet been released on licence, but, you know, we're in the ballpark of that possibility. So it's even really pivotal that it happens at this moment in time. So once again, of course, when it comes down to how he's going to plead, he pleads not guilty to Sarah's 1991 murder. He's got away with it before. Why won't he get away with it again? And then in May 2023, so this is so recent, 24 years into his sentence for Amanda's murder and more than 30 years after Sarah was killed and mutilated, 67-year-old Smith was found guilty of Sarah's murder at Inner London Crown Court. And that piece of S was sentenced to life with a minimum of 27 years. As we'd expect, he showed absolutely no emotion when the sentence was passed. And the judge actually stated this: "I have no doubt your premeditated and planned intention that night was to kill and sexually mutilate an escort to satisfy your perverted and sadistic sexual desires." And he's absolutely right. And how grateful are we that he gets an extra 27 years added onto his sentence. Thankfully, it's very likely now that Smith was going to die in prison. And if he did, by some miracle, actually survive the minimum term, he's going to be in his 90s when he's actually released. He's not going to be a threat to anybody. During his time incarceration, he has never expressed any remorse for his crimes. And ultimately, for me, what is really, really sad is we get the verdict we want. We absolutely do. But there are people who don't get to witness it. So Sarah's parents both died before having the opportunity to see the daughter's killer finally brought to justice. And don't get me wrong, they're back with their daughter now. And justice will not be as important in that life as it is in this. But it would have been wonderful for them to actually have seen it, to have looked him in the eyes, and to have known that no other woman is ever going to be in danger because of that monster. After he was sentenced, her family read this statement: 30 years may have passed, but we still miss Sarah. She was a shining light in a murky world who wished for the best, but found the worst of humanity. I think that's very beautifully put, but also testament to a woman who had such great meaning and a legacy of love that's been left behind, and an individual who will not be generationally forgotten because of the kind of person that she was. Now, it's unsurprising that it's suspected that Smith may have been responsible for loads of other unsolved sex offences and murders, because it's highly unlikely the offences that he was actually apprehended for were his only crimes. I mean, especially bearing in mind that he was a lorry driver. Honestly, think about all the access you've got there. Think about all the sex workers that you come across. Think about how life used to be without CCTV, without mobile technology, because people just weren't traced in the way that they're traced these days. And he would have been travelling all over the country and would have had an enormous amount of access and an enormous propensity for darkness and depravity that he carries with him all the while. Why would that not have played out in other crimes? Potentially, this guy is a prolific serial killer. Potentially. That's what I think. Genuinely. I believe he is a prolific serial killer. I mean, he's certainly an unrepentant sexual sadist and predator of women. He was willing to use whatever force he needed to satisfy himself. His targets were almost exclusively sex workers as well, because he was so planned and organised in that respect that he knew that he could get them alone at a location of his choice. He could literally procure a victim wherever he wanted them. And they weren't expecting that he was going to be armed with a knife. And they certainly weren't expecting that it would be a knife that he was quite happy to use. This man killed purely to satisfy his perverted sexual obsession. And I genuinely think this won't be the end of the story. I genuinely think that over the next coming years, we're going to hear his name time and time and time again. And hopefully, in the next decade or so, some of those women who disappeared, whose bodies turned up, will finally be linked to this killer. Because undoubtedly, like I said, in my mind, he is a serial rapist, a serial murderer, and a serial danger to all women. And like I said, looks like he'll be being carried out in a box one day. And then we can all do a dance on his grave when that happens. I don't know how you feel about this case. Do you agree with me? Was he a serial killer? Is he a serial killer? Do you agree with me that we're going to find lots of other cases being linked to him? Or do you think it could be that maybe he did just murder these two? Like I said, the jury's out on that. Hopefully a different jury than the one that acquitted him back in the day. Anyway, let me know your thoughts, and what justice was served in the end is a justice that at least rests easy on our minds, because we know this killer is never, ever gonna lay a hand on another woman in the rest of his days. And that is something to celebrate. See you again next time, guys. Take care. Be safe.